Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our April Core Collective series. I am thrilled to be here today. For those who I have not met, I am Jenny Goodman, the Director of Community_VC. And we are live with Amory and Sooah for our April edition of our Core Collective series, which are a string of events that uncovers learning from inspiring leaders in the _core. I'm incredibly excited to have Amory Wakefield. She's the Chief Product Officer at Hydrow and long-time core community member. Before we get started, a little bit of housekeeping. The goal of this event is to gather collective learning, so we hope you'll add to this conversation. Drop any questions you have in the Q&A section of the chat, and we'll be able to ask those to Amory. We'll also be live tweeting today, and you could join us there at _VC on Twitter. Just a quick reminder on who we are at _. We are a community-driven early stage venture firm. We back seed stage founders, predominantly in the B2B SaaS space. And the community behind our community-driven model is the _core, a curated network of founders, entrepreneurs, executives, and subject matter experts designed to support each other and also our portfolio. We work in partnership with the core in every aspect of our investing, from sourcing to selecting to scaling. And we'll drop a link in the chat where you can learn more about the _ community. And with that, I will hand it over to Sooah, principal at _, to kick off the conversation with Amory.
Thank you, Jenny. It's such a pleasure to be with you all today, and it's wonderful to be able to have Amory join us here today with her background across many different companies and easily one of the best female product leaders in our local ecosystem in Boston here. For those of you that I haven't met yet, I'm Sooah, principal at the _VC investment team, and just a little bit background about my own self. I have a background in product leadership myself prior to joining _, in addition to an investment background. Most recently was a product leader at Devoted Health and CVS. So a mix of different health tech product experiences and some investment work with Bain Capital and Kona Capital before as well. Amory, who's joining us, is currently the Chief Product Officer at Hydrow, the leading at-home connected rower for those of you that are passionate about rowing. She's a strategic product leader, has built high-performing product teams, and successfully launched key products at technology companies of all sizes. So it's both like physical products like Hydrow all the way to software products. And some of the companies that she's worked with in the past is TrueFit, E-Ink, Continuum Managed Services, and Texas Instruments. So it runs the whole gamut, and we're excited and privileged to actually hear from her deep expertise and experiences across those many companies. She's also an alum from one of the schools right in our backyard here at MIT. And with that, I'll actually kick us off. And thank you, Amory, for being here with us today.
Oh, thank you, Sooah, and thank you for that really kind introduction. It's a delight to be here, and I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Awesome. Well, maybe just to set the stage for folks that are here with us, and maybe folks who aren't as familiar with Hydrow and TrueFit, some of the companies that we're going to be discussing, can you share a little bit about the background, why you chose to join Hydrow, maybe as we get started?
Sure, and I think one of the comments I sometimes get from friends is when you look at my background, it doesn't follow one industry. So it's not like health tech or it's not this. They're like, you jump around. And I said, I really love applying what you learn in different industries to new problem sets. And I think that the skills you learn in one can be similar to the other. But let's talk about probably my two most recent roles. So at TrueFit, I was the first product hire, joined right after their B round closed. Reported directly into one of the original founders who'd been the CMO and acting lead of product. And that's a time I really like to join companies. TrueFit, for those of you who haven't used it, makes size and style recommendations on e-com sites in clothing and footwear. So if you are trying to buy the right size of pants from Ralph Lauren and you've bought a pair of pants from Madewell, we can help you pick a size. And it increased conversion and lowered return rates on e-com sites. So that's the business model there. But I joined when that product already had a foothold. We had a couple dozen customers, and the goal was to grow to 200 over the follow-on years, which we were successful in doing. And then Hydrow, I joined during the pandemic, which was not a great time for e-com in clothing and footwear, especially, but for connected fitness was a real, it, I think, just drove a lot of consumer demand for it. Similarly, they launched their product about a year before. They put their first Hydrows in homes in summer of 2019. I joined in 2020, and they were in this upward scaling curve. And for me, having the product, the MVP out there with some adoption is a time I really love to join. Right after the B round closes is not an unusual place for me. Similarly, I was the first, they'd had one product manager prior to me being there, and a couple of designers, but I was the first sort of product leader that they put on the team.
That's awesome. And personally, a huge fan of Hydrow. Just to say it, I don't own one myself, but I've actually visited a friend and discovered it and actually go hang out there sometimes to just try it out more. So both of those, I think, are really awesome experiences. And we spend a lot of time both in the health tech and like fitness kind of spaces, in addition to e-commerce, which Underscore spends a lot of time in. It's where our deep expertise actually lies. In some ways, I'd love to actually touch on a thread you already started on in terms of, for many of the founders that are joining us today and that we often work with, there's a lot of debate and questions around, hey, I'm the founder. What's the right time and moment for bringing on the first product leader? And it's kind of interesting that you started off as the first hire at TrueFit, for example. What would you say and advise to founders on when is the right time to bring on the first product person, and who's the right type of profile, the right level of expertise and experience to look for when you're thinking about your first product hire?
Yeah, I think it very much depends who you are as a founder and what strengths you're bringing to, particularly early on, is what of all the things you need to run your company you feel like you bring and what will complement you the most. So I think most of my experience is with pretty visionary founders who have a clear vision for what they want their product to be. And that is why I think they hire their first product lead sort of later in the cycle when they've already gotten their product to market, because their vision is what drives that first introduction. Whereas I have friends in the product world, and I've certainly talked to leaders who are more technically based, like they understand the technical solution, but they need somebody to link that technical solution to product fit. If you are a technical founder, you might need a product lead earlier in your cycle to help you bring that product to market. Depending on what it is, you might choose to hire someone who's with more marketing skill background or with more technical background, depending on what complement you're looking for. And I think early on, the most important thing is that relationship with a founder becomes really, really important. After the B round closes, I usually when I am interviewing, I need to understand the founder's vision, buy into it. I want to be supportive of it and become a real advocate for it. So at TrueFit, for example, I think part of how I got the job and why they liked me was I see what you put on every day is one of the few creative things people get to do. So the problem space that they were solving, which was helping people feel better in the clothes they buy, I can get really passionate about myself. So it's really important that your product leader is passionate about the thing that you're going to be the product lead for, or at least the problem space it's solving.
Yeah.
And second, though, is the most important relationship for me has always been with the tech lead. And so whether that's the CTO or a VP of engineering, like when you're trying to scale, the product lead and the tech lead just need to be in real sync on what the plan is, how you're going to prioritize features versus tech debt versus technical innovation. I think if you're in the really early phases, your relationship with the founder and that working relationship is far more impactful on how successful the business is going to be.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And oftentimes, actually, among all the different types of hires, I do think for the CEO and the founder who is starting the company, this can be one of the most important hires that you bring on to bring the product to the world and bring it to market. And it can be such a game-changing relationship and hire, but at the same time, it's also really hard to get right. And there can be sort of a little bit of tension at times, depending on who's really setting the vision and driving it and bringing it to life overall. Yeah. So maybe from your perspective, how do you think about you're obviously an incredibly qualified product leader. What would founders need to think about if they wanted to hire someone like you? And from your perspective, what are the things that you kind of touched on it already, but things that you think about or look for when you're choosing the right role in terms of joining as a product leader of your caliber?
Yeah, I think first and foremost is how visionary do you want your product leader to be? So I would not say that I am somebody who wants to set the vision of where the company wants to go. Mm-hmm. You decide the what you want to do or where you want to go. And I really am fascinated by how to make that happen and mm-hmm. how to scale it, how to make it bigger, the first interview with my CEO at TrueFit, I said to him, he's like, how are you going to prioritize from the 200 things that we want to do? And I said, what are your 3 goals for the year? Your business goals, not your product goals. Mm-hmm. I said, great. Half the things you've already told me about don't even help you with those goals. So I wouldn't do mm-hmm. those, right? If these are really the things you want to achieve. Mm-hmm. So that back and forth and conversation of taking the business strategy that you want to take out into the market or the problems that you want to solve and figuring out how to help make really strategic choices to do it is what I love to do. And so working through that conversation in an interview in a realistic way, that was one example I just gave where they gave me a list of 20 things, which would you like to do first, and seeing what questions I had, how that flowed, whether we are understanding one another, whether the rationale I'm giving you with pretty limited data makes sense is a great way to sort of choose whether you're going to get along with that product person. I think if you're somebody who is really looking for somebody who can take it into market. I know one of the debates TrueFit had was I didn't have fashion background. A lot of them did. And when they asked me about it, I said, all of you seem to have a lot of connections into the market you want to be in. I don't know that you need your product lead. I'm not going to be giving you introductions into Macy's. I'm not going to have a network of customers, but there are product leads that you might want to hire out of the industry if that's where your biggest gap is, that understands the customer problem and the customer set really well. Again, back to that. Think about your strengths as a founder and where you need a complement to that and what things you want that product person. It's such a jack of all trades. One of the questions I ask is frequently how externally facing do you expect your product lead to be? And I would say in both of my last hires, it's been what do you mean external? Your job is to make sure engineering's building the right stuff. I'm like, okay, great. I can do that. When you're ready, you're going to want me out in front of customers. It'll happen. I'm ready to do that. And I would say the arc at both TrueFit and Hydrow, that became it. But it's a question you should ask yourself. Who are you looking for when you're trying to hire somebody, and what breadth of skills are you going to need from them over the next couple of years? But as we wanted to bring new products into market, you're going to want your product person out talking to customers, talking about the benefits and adjusting the plans based on what they hear. How much do you talk to your board, right? Are you about selling, or are your board and investors going to want to talk to your product strategist? Those are things to think about and ask and talk through. Does this product person have experience with that? Are they comfortable with it? Is it where they want to play?
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. And not just the board, because that's one level of still internal parties, but representing your product vision and also how it's marketed and shared and positioned overall to your end customers, and even being savvy with how it's positioned against competitors in the space as well. So there's a very unique set of things that the product leader often is involved with that touches and interacts very closely with the founder's role. So what you're sharing, I think, makes a lot of sense. Maybe to ground it in a specific experience, I'd love to hear a little bit of what was it like day one arriving in TrueFit? You were the first hire as the B round was getting done, is like what you're saying. How did you think about the set of business strategy and the problems that you were trying to solve. What were they at the time? How did you approach it? Would love to hear a little bit more about the specific examples of how that experience was at TrueFit specifically.
For sure. The first thing coming in as a product, when you have a pretty established team, somebody's been doing it. And so the first thing I did day one was sort of like, how, what's your sprint structure? How are you deciding what goes into that sprint? Who's making that decision? Where's the meeting where that's happening? And through the interview process, I knew there was a roadmap meeting that had been identified as a pain point that included the whole executive team, where the high level strategic direction was being set. But that's not actually when the code's getting written. So where was that happening? And that was engineering. And so it turned out there was kind of the founder was setting strategic direction, and then that was happening. We had a UX lead who was designing and a head of design or creative director who were designing what it would actually look like on the e-com sites. So it was kind of pieces here and there. The UX director reported into me, so she and I started chatting a little bit, but engineering had kind of locked them out of the actual planning of what exactly we're going to build and when, mostly because they didn't have the technical bridge to talk about what the underlying infrastructure might need to be. And so the conversation would just drift towards what's the front end look like? And that was it. And there's so much more to that product. There was a data science model, there was modeling the sizes. And so figuring that out was my first sort of week, was like, where are decisions being made today? Building my relationship with the engineers to be included in those conversations. Bug triage was twice a week and all together, because the team was 6 engineers or 8 engineers when I started. So that was the whole team. We all got together and did triaging. And then sitting down with the founder, who Romney was fantastic. He was my boss, but every time I talked to him, he had 5 more ideas of things we might do, and sorting out how to talk to him about, okay, this is 5 new things from what we talked about 2 days ago. Do you want me not to work on the ones from 2 days ago and replace them with this? Where are you? And he's like, oh, no, this is for longer out. I'm like, okay, we're just gonna keep a backlog over here of all the great ideas we have, and I'll keep executing on these. But how to navigate that relationships and understand how somebody with just an infinite number of ideas would work. And then the last was sitting with the CEO and the head of sales and being like, what are blocking? One of our major goals was expanding the number of retailers who had signed on. And so did we need to support kids was a real strategic debate that we were having when I first started. And so how are we going to decide whether or not to support kids? How can we do that without disrupting other features that we're doing? Which opportunities are dependent on it? How big are they? If we don't get those, what are we filling in that conversation? So you can see kind of a wide gamut of things in that first week to kind of start to put together that I think span product.
Yeah, no, it kind of gives a window into the various touch points throughout the organization you need to have and build good relationships, and also just kind of navigate all the complexity of problem solving for the strategy that's ahead, and kind of working together to figure out the right places to focus, and learning to tactfully say no to all the different things that are probably great ideas and things to do, but you don't have the resources to do day one. So it's a very interesting thing that so many product leaders navigate, and doing that well and still making sure people on the team love you and want to work with you, even though you're saying no to all of them. It's always that tricky balance that we have to strike. Because a lot of the founders joining us are coming from the e-commerce world, I heard a couple things that you shared around the goals for TrueFit at the time, both around helping retailers. The selling points seem to be driving conversion and lowering return rates. And I think these are actually common goals for many e-commerce players, that they are promising those things to merchants and retailers. What did you find to be the best ways to demonstrate that, improve those, and demonstrate the ROI for customers? And what were the most surprising things that were unexpected roadblocks, and in terms of achieving those rates and targets for the customers?
Yeah, I think in my time there that evolved. So early on, I think when we we were working really closely with Nordstrom and Macy's were early adopters, both really huge e-com sites. And so they drove a lot of how we approached the ROI conversation. And also we understood what data they were able to provide. They were large, fairly organized, understood what data they had. But we did a lot of the work on their behalf to demonstrate it. So one of the things we would do is run A/B tests for them, bring the results and share it with them. And then I would say the most difficult conversations with e-commerce people were when they didn't believe their A/B testing tool was giving them a different answer than ours. And a lot of that had to do with identity resolution of who the people were on the site, being able to track their members, and returns. While intuitively you think if you're recommending size is the number one reason people return things, if you make that a better recommendation, it's clearly you're going to have less of that. Data in the return space was so dirty. It was very, very difficult to ever demonstrate that in a reliable way, either for us or for them. Just to give you a simple reason why that might, or a couple simple reasons, many of our retailers didn't connect in-store returns with e-com sales, even though they allowed it. Like they couldn't track them well, is one. So we'd say, look, on the e-com data, we're showing you that returns have gone down. And they're like, but overall returns from e-com are still going up. Like what's happening there? And we'd be like, well, we don't have any visibility into that data. So that would be one failure mode. Another, frequently the UI they send for the reason for your return, where it would be a little online survey. The first button is size. And if you test that and put something else at the top, it turns out that will be the most popular thing. You can affect your size returns just by reordering the options for consumers. And there was a lot of skepticism when we would say that also, that like you're getting returns because it didn't fit me could mean I didn't like the style. And if you phrased your questions differently, you'd get different data back on why people were returning things. Where we were more successful was in helping, because they were sharing a lot of their sales data with us, was the types of shoppers that you have. And I think some of our most powerful insights were things like, this many of your customers are one and done. These are size samplers. These are color samplers. Here's the value of them for a year on your particular site. And here's your super shoppers. Because we had visibility into their data, that wasn't something we were selling about it, but the fact that we could produce that, particularly on the color and size sampling and how to support those customers, that there are just a set of people out there who would buy 3 of the same shirt in different sizes, planning on returning 2. And like, how do we actually had some really good success prompting them of, hey, we've noticed you've added the same product with 3 different sizes or 2 different sizes to your cart. Try TrueFit and only buy one, so you don't have to go through the return, was one of our most effective ways of like reducing that behavior that a segment of the population was contributing to. So when we tied it back to users and what they were doing, I think we were far more successful than when we were caught up in this back and forth on which tool had truth and the dirtiness of the data that was out there.
That's for folks who've lived and breathed in the e-commerce world, this like dirty data resolution and also just attribution, making sure that you get credit for what you actually drove, make that, it seems like is a common pattern that a lot of folks struggle with. So for founders on the call, maybe that are getting started in this space that have similar goals that you're trying to drive for your retailers or merchants that you're working with, making sure that you start from the very beginning and setting expectations on what tools are going to be used, what data is going to be leveraged to measure success together, and setting that up front at the moment of signing the contract and like setting up expectations, and then making sure that that follows through with the customer success team, even beyond when it's time for renewal and when it's time to kind of look back at the data, like making sure that we're all staying on the same page on those things. Sounds like just critical groundwork to get right up front to kind of avoid some of those later debates. And you never want to be in a position where you have to debate with the customer on whose data is right and what you're going to trust and how you're going to attribute and what you're going to use to measure success. So there is some very helpful, I'm sure they were painful for you at the time, but helpful reminders for folks that are kind of navigating these similar waters today with customers themselves.
For sure. I think the longer I was there, the more I tried to push us into metrics that were farther up the funnel, both because there's more customers there. The The conversion has a lot of scrutiny on it. It's the most expensive part, is that last phase of the funnel. So money is tighter in general, and there's a lot of scrutiny on it. And so how could we demonstrate that we were improving the whole funnel and not just that last buy decision? I think helped us also to move out of that like deep argument with the data science people or the data people at the customer would be very, very focused on conversion rates, whereas time on page, return visits, how much time between visits, how likely they were to engage with your brand again, all of which we know drive sales eventually. We could show we were improving all of that, gets you to not just the business owner, but the marketing budget and the brand awareness budget and the customer satisfaction metrics that an e-com site might be doing.
Yeah.
Where we could expand the whole funnel instead of focusing on just this one clicking buy is a very hard problem to tackle if you're only focused on that.
Yep. It makes a lot of sense. And in general, I think it sounds like TrueFit did reach a point where you were able to sort of draw powerful insights about shopper categories, right? About the customers, and have insights and be able to expose them to the merchants and the retailers. What were the things that you did that helped you do that well? And what were some options you considered in terms of monetizing that data? That's like always on the backside, all the data that you have, like what you can do with it, the possibilities. So can you share a little bit about that journey?
For sure. We had a pretty robust data science team that was both designing models for new products on how we would model things, and also developing insights, calculating the lift that we were providing. They had a broad range of things, and getting a strategic leader in that role, I think, was really helpful in starting to talk about how we might monetize it, what things were reliable, what would be repeatable. I would say we tried to develop an insight dashboard that we would share with retailers that would be sort of an out of the box, here are things you could see from the data insights that we have. That struggled to gain traction, mostly because not everyone at e-com wanted another tool to log into to look at plots. Interpreting that data was often custom on what does it mean for my business specifically. So that became a little bit tricky on like, oh, I've got this chart that you've given me, but I don't know how to interpret it or what actions I might take about it. So what does it drive me to do? And I would say that everyone wanted to see it slightly differently, right? Like I want my SKUs here. I want I don't want categories, or I want the categories to be slightly different. I want kids and I want commercial because we have a uniform business to be separate. Made it hard to standardize that product instead of making it custom. And I think we trained them a little bit, because when we were small, we did a lot of custom work for retailers as part of adding value to why they would work with us. And then as it went on, we wanted to standardize that to make it lower cost and lower effort for us to sustain as we had more retailers. So that was one thing on it. I think the other things that we started to do with our data was think about ways in which you could leverage it in other places other than the e-com site and the customer purchase. So for example, predicting how many of a new design would be sold based on features in the clothing. So, one of my favorite insights we ever discovered, which maybe doesn't surprise anybody, but crew neck versus V-neck t-shirts. V-necks sell out at smaller sizes than crew necks. That's for both men and women. It was actually quite surprising. I think that more personally, I sit in more of the middle of the size ranges. Sometimes I want to wear a crew neck depending on my style choice that day versus a V-neck, but there was a real clear distribution that V-necks, there's more extra smalls sold, and crew necks, far more extra larges sold. And so if you're designing a new style, to know that, oh, I should order more on the larger sizes when it's a crew neck versus a V-neck. And that's just one really simple one at one particular retailer that was consistent. So, hey, if you're dining 3/4 length sleeves or bright colors, let's help you choose how to plan your inventory across sizes. But that's a totally different department. That's in product development at the e-com side. And I think the data scientist and I had this thing that demonstrated all this value that could work, but we didn't necessarily put together the customer success and the sales tools for our sales team to really be successful selling the concept.
That's fascinating. So you guys were uncovering really helpful insights that could inform not just the inventory planning post design, but even from the product development and design, like what types of products should we develop once we have and know like what things are selling well, how much should we order of each size, and like up to that level of inventory planning. And that's, so you guys were sitting on such rich data and information that a lot of merchants and retailers would probably kill to like get that insight so that they can get the next product launch right. What would you do differently now that you've said that, in terms of, and maybe taking a step back further, you initially sell into the folks that are in charge of the funnel conversion, and right, like there are different profiles at even the retailers that are owning the budgets to purchase TrueFit, right? So who were the different profiles of users that would benefit from what you initially were selling, and then the different folks at the same organization that would benefit from the insights that were generated? And what would you have done differently, knowing that it's like across the different teams that would benefit from it? And
I think there's twofold at a startup on any time you want to introduce a new product in that way. And I think one is the external question, which you're asking on like, how would you identify the actual decision makers? How do you get introduced to them? I think anytime you're trying to gain traction on a new concept, it's like reintroducing your MVP. You need somebody at a customer who buys into your idea, that wants to help you navigate that, and is going to take a bet on something that isn't out there yet, even if you have a relationship. I think we had that at a retailer that it was painful enough for them that they were interested in it. But I think the other piece of it is internally making sure the organization is ready to sell to a different audience, think through the pricing model and the monetary model of selling to a different. So on e-com, it's about conversion. We do it as a multiple of revenue, or you do it in a revenue share. Like you have a whole set of pricing models that the sales team has put together. If you're trying to move upstream, how do you value that for the product development team? How do we price it? Where does the data live? How often are we giving them the insights? Well, how do we design that? It has a whole internal buy-in component as well. And for me personally, on this particular example, the thing I would change most is working harder internally on what the opportunity was and selling it. You know, we were probably 120 people by the time we were talking about this. Like there was enough organizational inertia that I needed to do more work internally to talk about what that opportunity was. I think if that first person at the customer had bought it instantly, it would have gone differently, but that rarely happens. So I need a little organizational help. And so I think if I'd had that, it would have been much easier to go shop that around to a number of different retailers and find 3 or 4 interested, one of which you might get over the line, right?
Yeah.
And have it. So
that's interesting, because it's maybe the main takeaway here is setting up the internal team structure and organization such that you're set up for success for the upselling and cross-selling you want to do across different product lines or different types of things that you want to monetize with all the rich data you've collected, and being set up to do that well, basically, and as you navigate it with customers, because it's going to take a bit of making sure you get to the right people and being ready to be able to talk about how much this is worth for them. And that takes a little bit of a different skill set or a different type of conversation, even internally, to be equipped and ready to drive that to a sales decision point.
I think that a thing about joining right after you close your B round, at least in my experience, is a moment of intense change in organizations. And I spend a lot of time thinking about the change your organization has to go through to be successful now that you have had a little bit of success, right? How do we go to that next level? And it's often a very different set of activities than what got us to the point that we have a product in market and we're making a little bit of money, or at least we're bringing in some revenue. It may not be profitable, but we're bringing in some revenue of our own. And so I think that internal scaling component of how you scale the inside of your business is a place I spend a lot of time today. And it's a place I spent a lot of time at TrueFit as well. And sort of how much can we as an organization absorb? How much innovation can we do? How many things can we take on? And that often doesn't scale proportionately with people. So, my founder's like, well, we've doubled the engineers. They can put out twice as many features. And I'm like, well, but we have 4x the business. So no.
Yeah.
It's like that.
Yeah. Been in those places, having those conversations myself. So there's a couple different threads that I want to pull on from the conversation, actually. Going back to the data, it's like the gold in the e-commerce world, right? It's the thing that actually, if you unlock well, can be a game changer for what you can bring to the table for the merchants and retailers. But if not, you're losing a huge opportunity if you don't get that right. So one of the questions that you kind of rattled off earlier was, where should that data live? How do we capture it? And things have changed, and even with consumer privacy regulations and a lot of things about how consumers choose to share data and when they're how it's captured and where it lives. Is there anything you would advise for founders that are navigating versions of this e-commerce world today about, from the get-go, how do you, even if that data insight is not what you're selling from the beginning, how would you set up the infrastructure and the product design such that you can monetize on the insights from the data very well down the road? And would you have done anything differently about the way that consent was managed with the users, for example? Or
so the data sharing with the retailers is a business and a trust partnership with your customers. And so I think that TrueFit actually, before I got there, had an immense amount of trust that they had built on how we were going to handle the retailers' data, on what was happening on their sites, and that we were a real trusted partner in that. And I think that started with having a VP of engineering that cared about access to data from the beginning. That customer data is kind of sacred and we're going to protect it, and who has access to it is going to be clear. We're going to have policies around that, even when we were quite small. And then we needed to do that to ask for Macy's to share their conversion data with us, right? Like that's a super sensitive piece of data. And so they've done a really great job of that. So that was something I think we did really, really well. On the consumer data side, we made a choice early on not asking. We asked for a lot of personal information that actually legally is not personal. So my height and weight, which feels very, very personal to me. You don't collect anything else about me. You don't know my address. You don't know my email address. You don't, like, knowing that I'm 5'7" and what size I wear actually doesn't identify me. There are millions of women like me out, even in the Boston area. And so we did a really nice job of the data we needed that we built our product off of, which is your height, your weight, your age, and was a range. We didn't even ask for specific, like a decade was what we asked for, or 5-year buckets. And even a basic urban area is not identifiable. And so the core thing we were relying on was not personal. It was basically anonymized. Customers really wanted us to make it personal, and that drove us to start asking for logins, because I want to be able to log in and have access to my recommendations on both Macy's and Bowdoin and Nordstrom. I don't want to have to re-enter this information. And that's the other thing, is knowing when you are asking for something identifiable, like an email address, a password, or you're giving them an ID that will follow them around, that they're getting a benefit that they value at the same level for the information you're asking for. So when those regulations came out for us, it was actually fairly easy, because I was there when GDPR came into effect, when the CCPA came into effect. We made minor tweaks to be clear on what we were using it for and who it was being shared with, and had to do some deletion processes so that we could carve it out. But a nice thing for us is, as soon as we separated your name from or email address from all that data, we could continue to use it in our product, right? The fact that you had existed and purchased this thing and you were this size was not private once we disconnected it from the identifiable components.
Interesting. So being clear about how you, especially with the new regulations in place, manage that consent, and having identifiable data that's used in particular ways, but also having the right and setting it up such that you can de-identify and still use like broad insights across the industries in non-identifiable ways, and being able to have the capability to kind of aggregate that and use that for different purposes. Sounds like a very important thing to get right, and how you even structure the terms and the opt-ins that you need to
all of that. And also I think working with your data science team to make sure that or your engineering team, that they're keying off an anonymous identifier instead of one that's like I can match Sooah or Amory to XYZ as an ID that we're tracking, but as soon as I delete that it was attached to Sooah, that XYZ becomes meaningless. It's just a random number in our world. Was a really key thing that allowed us to completely anonymize data when we wanted to and use it for our data models. And I think that choice paid a lot of dividends in being able to retain data even when people were no longer wanted us to track them.
Yep. So some of the basic ways that data is captured and then also stored and then used in different ways. This is where the product leaders role again with engineering leadership, structuring it such that you can actually be flexible in how the data is captured and used. Sounds like a really important piece. And maybe one more thing around the data and how it's used. The thing that's sensitive in the retailer world is that oftentimes the customers that are using your product, they're competing with each other, right? And the insights that you draw for them are things that they want the data about the customer and want to also poach customers away from their competitor brands, right? Did you face any pushback or anything you learned about how to ease brands' concerns about data from their customers being used with other brands and supporting conversion for other brands, and or ways that you've still made it comfortable enough or the return on investment is high enough that they're okay in giving up some of that insights and their own customer data in order to capture the value that TrueFit is delivering? So any insights around managing those competitive dynamics among customers and the data play there?
Yeah, I think the size of the retailer really plays into the dynamic in that conversation. So if you are niche, you predominantly sell denim, for example. You don't sell formal wear. You don't sell a lot of footwear. Contributing to a data, I'm going to call it a lake, though I mean that in a very loose thing, a data collective that then allows us to say 30% of your customers spend 50, what we see them doing is spending 50% of their money on formal shoes, allows you to know although they're buying, this is how much they're spending here, they're spending way more on their budget over there. So the ability to provide a collective insight that gave them visibility into something that they could not see themselves made it worthwhile to hand their data into that. And vice versa, if you are a behemoth in the industry, that feels less relevant, although those insights might still be useful on what the top brands those people are shopping, or what niche sites they go to, when do they buy it on, a Nordstrom or a Macy's. Some of the brands they're carrying are also being carried. They now have their own e-com site. You can buy Ralph Lauren at Macy's. You can go to ralphlauren.com. How much they spend those can be an insight that you might be interested in. But I think it's a harder sell when they have a large amount and have a lot of insights themselves. Is a really difficult conversation. And one of the ways you can approach that is to partition data off. If they're large enough, they have enough of a data model you can build that's custom for them. Other smaller retailers, that might not be true. And you can just say, you're just not going to have enough volume or traffic for us to provide the insights you're looking for unless you contribute to something where a whole bunch of small retailers. And I think we had a CEO and some founders coming out of fashion retail business. That was their background, talking about how it's a business that struggles and it's an industry that can struggle, and how we were trying to help lift everything. So if more people are committed to buying clothing online, that's going to help everybody, because it means there's just more shoppers out there for you to tap into. And then you need to compete on your user experience, your customer service, your prices, which is what you want to do anyway, right? That would be some of our pitch as well. The data insights is one thing, but you should also, the reason people come back and buy clothes is because they love the experience and the clothes that they're buying.
Yeah.
Our mission was to make sure people loved the clothes they ended up with.
Yeah, I think the collective insights trade-off with data about your own customers and that striking the right balance to make it worthwhile for retailers is a really helpful one. And I think a lot of e-commerce players and founders are actually trying to do that, especially when you're initially going to market. You're probably starting with the smaller players anyways, and you'll figure out how to deal with the behemoths that are going to be less likely to collaborate with you and engage and in your go-to-market process overall. For the audience that's been with us, I'd encourage you to flag any questions you'd like to ask Amory. What we can do is dig into some of the questions that are coming up on the side. So feel free to ask flag Q&A on the side, and we can also use video Q&A for folks that aren't familiar. You can click on that and we can bring you onto the stage to ask a question directly and engage live as well. And for folks that are following on, feel free to thumbs up for the questions that you'd also love to listen to and make sure that we cover in particular. I'm going to start with Ben's question here. Amory, how much of your role is data-driven decision-making and how much is intuition? Do you find that founders and board members prefer data and how it can be interpreted or experienced?
That's a really great question, actually. I prefer data, but I think that they're like at an early stage, frequently the data you want is not at your fingertips or is limited or is messy, right? So it is, what is this actually telling me? So I'd say it's somewhere between 60 and 70% is data driven and 30 to 40% is data informed is what I would call it. It's not strict intuition, but we have some limited data that's pointing us in this direction, and I feel pretty confident about it. And then the question is, how can you test that without investing too much when you know that the data you're relying on is spotty, non-existent, or sort of we talked to one person and they said that. Founders and board members, I mean, it varies so much. I don't think there's one answer there at all. I think if you have a vision of what you want in market, frequently a founder doesn't really care about the data and thinks that it's right and just wants to plow forward on it. I've had those conversations. I've had a lot of, I think board members who have experience in the industry or in the solution you have a lot of their own knowledge they bring to bear and are certain something is true. The hardest of those conversations is when the world has changed from whatever their experience they're drawing on. And that takes a lot of, I don't find that I find data necessary in that conversation, but what actually sells it is the narrative to get them to see the picture of what is different. And so you need the data there to back up the claims you're making, but the way you tell that story and the narrative around it is the most important in almost all cases.
Yeah. And there's a related topic that you and I had chatted about and that I wanted to kind of attach to this question around visionary founders that have a vision, right, about how the world should be, what the product should do. What's your take on how to balance that vision with new data that's coming in from the customers and the market overall, and the role that you play as a product leader in kind of facilitating that balance and guiding the founder and the rest of the company towards sort of an agreement when sometimes that vision and the data don't even align all the time. So
yeah, I think that is one of the most important roles that a leader in product plays is sort of calling out on, hey, you need to buy into the vision of the company and the product that you're selling. So but if nobody's going to use it, you're not going to solve the problem and it's not going to be successful. And so that balance, I think, is something that you're constantly teetering. It's like a little balance beam that you teeter one way and teeter another on. But I do think it's really important to listen when you're starting to see wow, we were really excited about this and it went out there and it's not being adopted, or I'm going to talk on a very small scale, a feature that's not being adopted or used or grabbed in the way that we want, and being open to hearing why. And so I can return to the Insight product. I talked about it at TrueFit, where it had great insights. We tested it. We thought people would love it. And then people are like, oh, it's in a different place than I look at my other data from my internal tools, and I don't want to log into that. Right. And it's like, oh, but the data is so valuable. Why wouldn't you? And it's like, well, then I have to remind myself of what your stuff means. Like, really listening to that becomes really important, even though we had a vision of it being in our space.
Yeah.
And I think at Hydrow, similar thing. We talk about a lot of people who join a fitness company love fitness, and not every customer does. So when do you listen to the people who aren't loving it? It's not their best part of their day. If you enter every conversation assuming it's the best part of your day to work out, you're not going to make great decisions about what your customers are feeling.
Yeah. And it's your job to make sure that you guide the overall product vision together with the founder to kind of work towards that, and making sure you're pivoting at the right times and actually adjusting. Maybe if it's in the TrueFit example that you just mentioned, is highlighting and figuring out a way to get your data integrated into wherever the current work is being done, right?
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of solutions to that. I think the first thing is understanding that that's something we want to spend time and money on, right? Like that's going to be expensive, or how do we feel about that? And I find every company I've started at, I fairly quickly start up a voice of the customer, which is valuable for lots and lots of roles, where whoever is interacting the most with the customer, sales, customer support, services, like member services, whatever you call your customer facing roles, shows up and presents for a couple of hours on what they're hearing, what objections they're having to selling. But I find it's most valuable for your senior executives to really look over those key insights and think about which of these are challenges to our assumptions about what's happening in the market. And when they show up, I do it monthly, month in and month out, there's something real there. It's not one salesperson who's not handling an objection well. This is something the market is really telling us. What are we going to do about it? And I think that product is the place that can raise that flag and say, what should we change?
Yeah. And I think it's awesome. It's something we talk about a lot in the VC world too, with founders that are like, this is what we want and this is what we think we should build, and kind of watching for their ability to listen to customers is a really important quality that we look for. I'm going to go on to the next question here by John V. How do you decide when is the right time to expand the product offering beyond the core? How did you navigate that at TrueFit?
So I think that actually gets back to one of the things we were just talking about. I think that our founder's vision was to have multiple products. And so there was pressure to do that might not have matched what the market or our customers were ready for us to solve. So that exact conversation we were just having on the vision of, we want to solve more problems for customers. We have an idea. We should get it out there as quickly as possible. The things that I think about are internally what you can support. So the complexity of going from one product offering to two product offerings is immense, no matter what kind of business you're in. It affects almost every department there. You have to retrain sales, need to know when to sell one versus the other. It has huge benefits to your business because you have two different things. You can play with profitability, you can sell one, you can play with packaging. But the first question I ask is, when are we ready to do that? And to really be honest with yourselves about the complexity it's going to introduce into your organization. And even every time I've done it, there's a moment where you're like, yep, that's going to be really painful for finance. That's going to be super painful for customer success. We're just going to live with that for a little while, but being honest about that up front helps that a little bit, because it's really hard to get every department 100% ready for that complexity before you go out into the market. But taking that leap, I think, and being honest about where you're under hiring or who you're going to need to shore up from other places before you introduce it is really important.
And I guess that's it's a common theme we've been talking about throughout today's conversation, but maybe one more nuance there around sequencing. And even if you're not launching and setting up and hiring the whole team to go out and build out the org structure to enable it,
That's right.
What are things you would have done from a sequencing standpoint in terms of testing the value of the data insights product, for example, while you're still working on the core? Like, what are things you can do in preparation for that next stage when you're not quite there, and then figuring out the right moment to turn the switch on to start?
Yeah, I think it's actually like one of the most fun things that product people do, but also like one of a critical skill set is that sort of what's the minimum investment we can make to test if this is going to be successful, and to constantly be asking that. I think that the thing I would like to do differently is not get too far ahead on the revenue projections that you're promising for something new, your introduction, before you have some of that market testing done. That would be my lesson, because if you've already committed the revenue, there's a ton of pressure to keep plowing down that path, even if you're getting signs that, oh, we need to pivot or we need to reinvest, or the key thing that we thought would be valuable is actually not why people are buying something. If you have revenue attached to it, it's really hard to say, oh, we want to pause for 2 months and fix that and reintroduce it. It becomes a really difficult conversation. Whereas if you're like, we're going to pilot it for a few months with kind of lower expectations, can be better. That would be the, if it were up to me, that's how I'd love to do it. That's not always possible.
Yeah. And I think that like lean experimentation on what has to be true, what are sort of the signs and signals we're going to really look for while running some lean tests, and then make sure that we're still staying focused on the core product today. I think those are some really helpful things. And I think the separation between putting on revenue pressure from day one as you're running those experiments is something that's probably critical, and definitely before you go out and hire and build out a whole team to do this, right? Yeah. Because that readiness is also part of the success for enabling it, like you mentioned, but just kind of doing it in different sequences to make sure you do step by step and get the right market signal.
And I'm a big believer in some contingency on like, what if it doesn't succeed? Like, what's the plan for that? Like, are we willing to pull the plug on it? Or do we have a different way to fill in that revenue? If you have made a revenue plan that we're going to invest more in sales in this area, like, what are we going to do about it? Is a good conversation to have. I think it's sometimes hard to have that conversation because you want to be optimistic and plan for success. But I think there is a moment for sitting there and saying, what if we're wrong? And how are we going to handle that?
Yeah. There's a lot more to cover on this topic, but I'm going to go to our next question here from Rajiv. A long time back, Hydrow was talked about as the Peloton of rowing. That was when that was perceived as a good thing. Today, people feel they overreached, given that how are you setting product direction to not continue in that way, business model, audience, anything that's changed your mind?
Yeah, the Tatler referred to us as the Peloton of rowers just last week. So it still floats around in the UK. I think the market environment that you're in affects, you have to be aware of it. And right now, I think the big gorilla in connected fitness has had a lot of missteps. And I think it's great to be a fast follower sometimes because you can copy all these things that were successful. But I think it's also can be a moment to reflect on which of these things were not great. I think the thing that we did really well was recognize that the demand that the pandemic created for connected fitness, we've been planning from the beginning, wasn't forever, right? This is great. We should capitalize on it. We should get as many customers as possible, but at no point are we taking that growth and predicting that it's going to continue on this same usage component. The day a vaccine was announced, we're like, okay, what should we expect from usage? What are we going to do about that contingency of what if we're wrong on our churn projections, on our usage projections, what are we going to do about that? I think that also we spend a lot of time talking about product and workout style introduction, which is what we were just talking about. In connected fitness, we have three parts. You have the hardware that we're selling, which could have different products there. You have the content offering, which is the types of exercise that you're offering, and talking about when to invest in that and how and why is a lot of what we spend time on. I think Peloton went bike and tread and strength products. It is a lot to try to introduce to market. And does everyone want all of those in their house? There's definitely a segment that do, but I think we spent a lot of time trying to be really deliberate about what things we're going to invest in those areas. Yeah.
And as investors, we actually think about this. There were things like telehealth that took off during COVID that aren't always going to be at the same rate of growth coming out overall. Although I'm sad to say this, but it sounds like we thought we were going to be done with the pandemic a year ago today, and even today, and it's unclear exactly where we are as it stands with the pandemic. So not to end on a downer, but hopefully everyone's navigating the uncertainties of what does the current ongoing pandemic mean? How do we all adapt to it, and all the ups and downs of the new normal, quote unquote, that we're figuring out? What is that in the workplace, for how we work out, how we live our lives?
And I think on that note, for Hydrow, connected fitness was growing. Peloton built its business long before there was a pandemic. We don't see any reason why it won't return to that same kind of growth curve. So
yeah. So I want to be mindful of everyone's time and just thank everyone for joining us here. And in light of what we just talked about, hopefully everyone stays healthy and well, no matter where this pandemic goes and how long we're dealing with this. But thank you, Amory, for joining us today, and everyone else who dialed in to join us. And would be excited to welcome you all, hopefully in person soon, as we regather and regroup the core community in person shortly as well. So thank you, everyone, and have a good night.